Hello crafty friends, welcome to today's video. I'm sure a lot of you have already seen the recent Lou Collins video in which she did the Marion Embossing pouncing heat embossing technique. I really liked what she did by running her heat embossed skins through her die cutting machine with dies and embossing folders. But I thought, I haven't got the patience personally to peel off all the little bits of baking parchment that get stuck to the heat embossing. I wonder if I can do a similar thing but without that happening. So that's what I'm going to do in this video. So first things first, I took a piece of parchment paper and a square of smooth white card, big enough to die cut from. I then took an assortment of embossing powders from my stash and sprinkled them all over the card in a fairly random arrangement. I think the pinks that I've got here are Wow Dappled Effects embossing powders. I've also got their rich gold and some ultra high opaque white, which is a chunkier embossing powder. So I'm just sprinkling those on, as I say, onto this piece of card to get a pleasing arrangement. Once I'd finished that, I folded the baking parchment over to cover up my embossing powders, heated up my heat tool, and then started to melt the embossing powders through the baking parchment. Obviously there's no embossing ink on my card, so there's nothing to stop my embossing powders blowing away. So that's why you cover it with a bit of parchment paper. You'll have seen me do this kind of thing using a travel iron to melt the embossing powders through the parchment paper. And I was going to do this today, but my travel iron has decided to stop working, so I did the pouncing technique instead. And with this, you just take your heat gun nice and hot and pounce it up and down on your baking parchment. You have to do it quite rapidly. You have to make sure that you don't cover the vents on your heat tool and that you don't press the nozzle down and keep it down, otherwise it will overheat and you might melt your nozzle. So you just keep pouncing it up and down and wiggling it around. You can flip it over and heat it from the bottom, heat it from the top. And before my embossing powder had a chance to cool and set, I took my stamp press tool, which is an air hockey thing, and used it to squish my embossing powder and spread it around underneath the parchment paper, heating it a bit and then squishing it a bit and then heating it a bit. So this kind of mimics the action that my travel iron would usually do. I then, before it had a chance to cool and set again, peeled back the parchment paper and added a few little extra sprinkles of embossing powder where there were gaps. I then held my piece of card with a pair of tweezers and heated from underneath. If I'd heated from the top, I would have blown all that embossing powder away, and I didn't really want to go through the whole rigmarole with the baking parchment. And I only had a little bit of embossing powder to melt this time, so it was just easier to hold it and heat from the bottom. And then when I'd heated from the bottom and all that embossing powder was trapped, I then gave it a good blast from the top to make everything shiny and glossy and make sure every last little bit of embossing powder had melted. When it had cooled and set, I used a heart-shaped die to cut a heart shape, funnily enough. And then I set about doing the dry embossing. Now, I think it's a good idea to have everything gathered and set up before you start this. So I had my embossing plates next to me, my die cut machine next to me, an embossing folder open and ready to go. And what I did was I just heated gently and momentarily the embossed heart, and that just softened it a little. I didn't want to remelt it, I just wanted to soften it and make it more malleable. I then quickly put it in my embossing folder, closed that, put it in my plates, ran it through my die cutting machine, and I got a beautifully dry embossed, heat embossed heart. I then got out some gold gilding wax, brushed that over to highlight some of the raised areas. I buffed off excess with a microfiber cloth, popped some foam tape on the back and then stuck it on the front of a card blank and gave it a sentiment. And that was really, really easy. And I didn't get any baking parchment stuck to my heat embossed heart. I didn't have to peel anything off. If you are worried about the heat embossing sticking to your embossing folder, you can prepare your embossing folder or your die cut by covering it in embossing ink. I used a Ranger Dauber to cover the embossing folder in embossing ink, and then I ran my heart through and it popped out beautifully. I didn't get any sticking. And the embossing ink just provides kind of lubrication. I think it stops any embossing powder sticking to the inside of the embossing folder. And that's my take on this technique. I hope you found it helpful. I hope you've enjoyed the video and it's given you some ideas. If it has, do let me know in the comments. Like, subscribe, ring the notification bell, and I'll see you back here very soon for another video. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.